Your garden is dying in the middle of summer, and you're dragging a hose across the yard for the third time today, burning water, burning time. 3 kilometers away, in a pottery shed with no electricity and no irrigation system at all, a small clay pot buried in the dirt is keeping a tomato plant fed, hydrated, and thriving. It hasn't been touched in 6 days. Same heat, same soil, two completely different outcomes. And the difference between them isn't technology. It isn't money. It's a trick that farmers documented 2,000 years ago, then every major agricultural institution quietly stopped teaching, for reasons that have nothing to do with whether it works. What if your garden never needed watering again? Not for a day, not for a week, but never, not in the way you've been doing it. The answer is buried in the ground. It costs $12. And the science behind it is so elegant, so counterintuitively simple, that once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. That's where this starts. In 1974, a researcher digging through ancient Chinese agricultural texts stumbled across a document called the Fan Shengzai Shu, one of the earliest farming manuals ever written, compiled during the Han Dynasty more than 2,000 years ago. The instructions were startlingly precise. Make 530 pits per hectare. In the center of each pit, bury an unglazed earthen jar holding 6 liters. Leave the mouth level with the ground. Fill the jar with water. That's it. No pumps, no timers, no daily maintenance. The manual simply noted, with the confidence of someone documenting an obvious fact, that a single jar would sustain a crop through the driest months of the growing season, requiring a refill only once per week. But here's what makes this stranger. The manual doesn't explain why it works. It doesn't theorize, it simply records. Thousands of farmers followed these instructions for centuries, not because they understood the physics, but because the harvests proved the method. The yields came. The crops survived droughts that killed their neighbors' fields. The technique passed from generation to generation, not as science, but as obvious truth. And then, somewhere between the mid-20th century and now, it nearly vanished. The same technique wasn't just Chinese. That's the part that stops you cold. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, archaeologists found the physical evidence. Ancient buried irrigation vessels used to sustain agriculture in one of the harshest climates on Earth. In pre-Columbian America, the Hohokam people of what is now Arizona built entire buried pot irrigation networks that supported dense populations in desert conditions for 1,000 years. When Spanish colonists arrived in the 1500s, they didn't find struggling subsistence farmers scratching at dry soil. They found irrigated gardens, thriving fields. They found people who had solved the water problem without modern engineering, using nothing but fired clay and soil physics. In Spain itself, the technique was standard practice. It traveled to Mexico and Latin America with the colonizers, who had the unusual good sense to recognize a superior system when they saw one. Multiple civilizations, multiple continents, multiple millennia, all arriving at the same answer independently. When the same solution appears across unconnected cultures in completely different climates, that's not a coincidence. That's physics announcing itself. But here's where it gets interesting. The physics behind this technique is not ancient mystery. It has a name, and you've seen it your entire life without ever calling it that. It's called capillary action, and it is one of the most quietly powerful forces in nature. You've seen it when water climbs the side of a glass without being poured, when a paper towel touches a spill, and the moisture races upward through the fibers against gravity, when a plant draws water from the soil up through its stem to leaves 10 meters above the ground, without a pump, without pressure, without any energy source you can point to. That movement is capillary action. Liquid moving through narrow spaces due to the molecular attraction between water molecules and the surfaces they touch. Water is sticky, not in the obvious way, but at the molecular level. Water molecules cling to each other through a force called cohesion and cling to surfaces through a force called adhesion. In very narrow channels, the microscopic gaps between soil particles, the pores inside a clay wall, these forces are stronger than gravity. Water is pulled upward, sideways, toward dry zones, toward surfaces, toward roots, because molecular attraction wins over weight when the spaces are small enough. Soil is essentially a network of these microscopic channels. When one zone of soil is dry, the molecular tension in that zone is high. That tension acts like a pull, drawing water toward it from wherever water exists nearby. Scientists call this soil moisture tension. Farmers call it the soil deciding it's thirsty. And a buried, unglazed clay pot placed in dry soil. That pot is surrounded by high tension. The water inside experiences that pull through the porous clay walls. And it moves not because of pressure, not because of gravity, but because the physics of the dry soil is drawing it outward, molecule by molecule, at exactly the rate the surrounding earth demands. That's not irrigation, that's a biological negotiation. The self-regulation is the part that changes everything. A sprinkler doesn't know if it rained last night. A drip system runs on a timer that cannot feel the soil. Both deliver water on a schedule, and schedules don't match plant needs. Overwatering is not just waste. It's a driver of root rot, of fungal disease, of shallow root systems that never learn to seek water independently. Surface water evaporates. Up to 35% of sprinkler water never reaches the roots at all. It rises back into the air before the plant can use it. A buried clay pot delivers only what the soil asks for. When the surrounding earth is saturated, after rain, after an earlier refill, the tension drops, the seepage slows. At full soil saturation, the seepage stops entirely. The water stays inside the pot, waiting. When the soil dries again and tension rises, the flow resumes automatically. No microchip runs this. No sensor reports to a controller. The pot and the soil run this negotiation through physics alone, continuously in real time, for the entire growing season. David Bainbridge at the University of California, Riverside, quantified what farmers had known for thousands of years. Buried clay pot irrigation delivers 50 to 70% better water efficiency compared to surface watering. Zero evaporation loss because the water is released below the surface. Zero runoff because the release rate matches absorption. And one more number that surprises almost everyone, an 87% reduction in weed biomass. Think about that last one for a moment. Weeds are surface feeders. The seeds that germinate in your garden are responding to the moisture signal at ground level. When you water the surface, you're broadcasting an invitation. A buried pot keeps the surface dry. Without that surface moisture signal, the weed seeds stay dormant. They're sitting in the same soil, but the top layer where they need to germinate stays dry. Your crops are drinking, your weeds are not. The yield data reinforces this. A study tracking weed pressure in India found that fields using surface irrigation produced 465 kilograms of weed biomass per hectare. The buried pot fields produced 62. The crops were the same. The soil was the same. The only difference was where the water was delivered. Surface watering feeds every plant indiscriminately. Subsurface delivery feeds only the crop. So how do you actually build one? The materials list is almost offensive in its simplicity. You need an unglazed terracotta pot, not glazed, not painted, not sealed. The system runs entirely on the clay's porosity, and any sealant kills it completely. A standard unglazed pot from any garden center costs $2 to $5. You need a cork, a small flat stone, or a dab of food-grade silicone to plug the drainage hole at the bottom. The pot needs to hold water, but only through the walls, not through the floor. One firm wine cork pressed in works perfectly. You need a flat saucer, a stone, or a small board to cover the opening at the top, preventing evaporation from the neck and stopping debris from falling in. That's the entire parts list. Total cost, $2 to $12 depending on pot size. No tools required beyond a shovel. Step 1. Choose your location. The pot needs to be placed within the root zone of the plants it's serving, not at the edge of the bed, not at a distance. Roots grow toward the water source. If the pot is close enough, they will find it within days. For a single large tomato plant or a melon, one pot positioned 30 to 40 centimeters from the main stem is sufficient. Step 2. Dig your hole. The pot should sit completely below the soil surface, with only the neck and mouth visible above ground. The sidewall contact between clay and soil is critical. This is where the tension gradient forms. Pack the soil firmly back around the pot after placing it. Air gaps break the connection. Step 3. Plug the drainage hole with your cork. Place the pot in the ground. Cover the neck with your saucer or stone. Step 4. Fill it with water. Step 5. Walk away. A 1-liter pot will consistently water a 2-foot circle of soil. A 3-liter pot serves a broader root zone and needs refilling less frequently. In peak summer heat, check once a week. If the water level has dropped, refill. If it hasn't dropped much, leave it. The soil is still retaining moisture from the last fill. The pot will never give the plants more water than the soil wants to receive. There is no such thing as overwatering with this system. After the first few weeks, dig carefully around the pot and examine the clay surface. You will find roots, dense, tangled, actively wrapping around the exterior of the clay, drawing moisture directly through the porous wall. The plant has found its water source and it is holding on. That's not incidental. That's the entire design intention of a plant that learned, over millions of years, to seek water at depth. Now scale this to a full garden. For a family growing food across 10 square meters, a modest but productive plot, 5 to 7 pots will cover the space completely, each serving a cluster of plants within its radius. Total materials cost $30 to $60 once for a system that will function for years without replacement parts, without maintenance contracts, without a single moving component to fail. Compare that to a basic drip irrigation setup, $200 to $500 for initial installation, plus annual replacement of emitters that clog, tubing that degrades in UV light, filters that require cleaning, and pressure regulators that eventually fail. The drip irrigation market in 2024 is valued at nearly $7 billion globally. That market requires its customers to keep coming back. Clay pots, by design, don't work that way. The moment you understand that number, $7 billion, the disappearance of this technique from modern agricultural education becomes considerably less mysterious. This wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a coordinated suppression campaign. It was simpler and more mundane than that. Agricultural extension services teach what university researchers study. University researchers study what industry funds. Industry funds what generates return on investment. A product you buy once, bury once, and never replace again does not generate return on investment. It generates one sale. So no company spent money promoting it. No research institution had financial reason to champion it, and it quietly drifted out of the curriculum, not because it failed, but because it had no revenue stream. The buried pot business model has a fatal flaw. You only have to buy it once. There is a modern evolution of this same principle worth understanding, because it takes the physics even further. Wicking beds are a contemporary adaptation that applies the same capillary logic to a raised garden container. Instead of individual buried pots, the entire bed is built above a sealed water reservoir. A column of sand or porous material runs from the reservoir up into the growing medium. Water in the reservoir is drawn upward through capillary action, continuously, wicking into the soil above at whatever rate the plants demand. One documented wicking bed, a 10-square-foot planting container, ran through an entire summer growing season producing tomatoes, peppers, and squash, and required only 2 refills over 6 months. 25 gallons total. For a full summer of food production from 10 square feet of growing space, in a dry climate, the water use was 2.5 gallons per square foot for the entire season. Those numbers are not a typo. The physics is the same as the buried clay pot. The application is more scalable. The same wicking bed can be built into containers, raised beds, rooftop planters, and balcony gardens where digging isn't possible. Recycled plastic tote containers, old bathtubs, repurposed horse troughs, anything that can be sealed at the base can become a wicking bed for under $15 in additional materials. 2 completely different implementations. The same underlying truth. Water moves through narrow spaces toward the dry zones that need it, without being told to, without needing power, without human intervention. We have spent decades being taught that water management requires complexity, that growing food in dry conditions means drip lines, timers, pressure regulators, and seasonal maintenance schedules, that passive systems are primitive systems, that simple is inferior. But every morning in Arizona, the ruins of Hohokam irrigation networks sit beneath the desert floor buried clay systems that ran continuously for 1,000 years without a single replacement part. In fields across China, Peru, Morocco, and Spain, the same principle kept harvests alive through droughts that decimated modern, expensive, maintained irrigation systems that clogged, broke down, and needed technicians. The most resilient systems in history have almost always been the simplest, not because simplicity is romantic, but because there's nothing to fail. No emitter, no timer, no filter, no power supply. When there's nothing to break, nothing breaks. You can spend $500 building an irrigation system that needs annual attention. Or you can spend $12, bury a pot, and let soil physics do the work that the soil has been capable of doing for the entire history of agriculture. The ancient farmers who documented this didn't frame it as clever. They didn't write treatises praising its elegance. They wrote it down the way you'd write down the time the sun rises, as a fact so obvious it barely needed explaining. Plant needs water. Soil tells pot, pot gives water, harvest comes. 2,000 years later, the pots still work exactly the same way. The question isn't whether the system functions. The question is why we forgot it. And the more interesting question, the one worth sitting with, is how many other problems we think are expensive, complex, and unsolvable have an equally simple answer buried somewhere that no one has financial incentive to remind us about. This is just one of many forgotten systems hiding in plain sight, and most of them cost less than a decent dinner.